October 15, 1987. Dr. Margaret Reeves stood at the lion enclosure railing, her 4-year-old son, David, beside her. The zoo was closing. Shadows stretched across empty walkways. She lifted her child over the barrier and dropped him into the pit. What happened next defied every instinct, every law of nature. The lions didn't attack. They surrounded the boy, formed a protective circle, and waited. For 17 minutes, security footage captured something that veterinarians still can't explain. The incident was buried, files sealed, witnesses silenced. But 36 years later, that footage surfaced. Margaret watched herself on the evening news, a mother who threw her child to lions. Except the woman on screen looked nothing like someone trying to kill her son. She looked like someone trying to save him. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
Margaret's radio crackled to life as she sprinted toward the African Savannah complex. Code Black, Lion Habitat 7. All emergency personnel respond immediately. Her breath caught in her throat. 23 years of veterinary emergencies, and she'd never heard that particular tremor in Security Chief Rodriguez's voice. Not panic, something worse, confusion. The midday sun blazed overhead as she rounded the corner, her medical kit bouncing against her hip. A crowd had already gathered at the viewing platform, their shocked faces pressed against the reinforced glass. Parents pulled children back. Someone was crying. Margaret pushed through, flashing her credentials. Move! Veterinary emergency! She reached the barrier and looked down into the enclosure. The boy lay motionless in the red dirt 18 feet below. Elena crouched beside him, her dark hair falling across her face as she whispered something Margaret couldn't hear. But it was the lions that made Margaret's scientific mind stutter. Kessie, the pride's dominant female, sat 3 feet from the child, not crouched in attack position, not circling, sitting. Her massive head tilted slightly, amber eyes fixed on the boy's still form with what Margaret's rational brain refused to call concern. The other 3 lions, Django, Amara, and the juvenile Tao, formed a loose semicircle around Elena and Marcus. Protective, deliberate, waiting. Dr. Chen! Rodriguez appeared beside her, sweat beading on his forehead. Thank God. We need tranq protocols now. But the angle's impossible with the mother in the enclosure and the lions. He gestured helplessly. They're not behaving like lions. Margaret's hands moved automatically to her radio, muscle memory engaging while her mind reeled. Protocol dictated immediate tranquilization of all 4 cats. But something in Kessie's posture stopped her. The lioness's tail wasn't twitching. Her ears weren't pinned back. Every indicator Margaret had learned in 2 decades of big cat behavior suggested calm, not predatory aggression. How long since they fell? She asked. 4 minutes, maybe 5. Long enough for a kill. Long enough for 4 adult lions to reduce 2 humans to... Margaret cut off the thought. Elena was alive, moving. And the boy? She squinted into the enclosure. Marcus's chest was rising and falling, unconscious from the fall, possibly injured, but breathing. Ma'am? Rodriguez pressed. Your orders? Elena looked up suddenly, as if sensing Margaret's gaze. Even from 18 feet away, across 20 years of silence and an ocean of bitter words, her sister's eyes locked onto hers. Elena's lips moved, forming words Margaret couldn't hear but somehow understood. Help him. The same words Elena had whispered in their grandmother's hospital room, when 6-year-old Margaret had refused to hold Lola's wrinkled hand during those final moments, when she'd chosen the sterile comfort of the hallway over her family's grief and their grandmother's rambling stories about spirits that lived in the spaces between heartbeats. Help him. The words Elena had said about Danny 3 years ago, when Margaret's son had stood at this very enclosure, pressing his face against the glass and speaking in that soft, particular way he had with animals. When Margaret had been too exhausted from a difficult surgery to notice her autistic son's fascination, too busy planning the next procedure to see the wonder in his eyes, too late to stop him from climbing that fence at home, trying to reach the neighbor's aggressive dog he'd been convinced needed healing. Dr. Chen? Rodriguez's voice seemed to come from very far away. Ma'am, I need orders. The board's en route. Media's already gathering outside. If we don't... No tranquilizers, Margaret heard herself say. What? She blinked, focusing on Rodriguez's shocked face. No tranquilizers yet. Get me a harness and a descent line, and clear that viewing area. Ma'am, with respect, that's suicide. 4 adult lions are exhibiting non-aggressive territorial behavior. The words came out steadier than she felt. Look at their posture, Chief. Kessie's protecting, not hunting. It was impossible. Everything in her training screamed against what she was seeing. Lions didn't protect human children. They didn't form defensive circles around prey animals. They certainly didn't sit patiently while a strange woman whispered what looked suspiciously like prayers over an unconscious boy. But as Margaret watched, Kessie shifted closer to Marcus. The massive lioness lowered her great head until her muzzle was inches from the child's face. For a heart-stopping moment, Margaret thought she was about to witness the most horrific mauling in zoo history. Instead, Kessie breathed out, a soft, rumbling exhale that ruffled the boy's dark hair. Marcus's eyes fluttered open. The crowd behind Margaret gasped collectively. Someone screamed, but Margaret only heard the thundering of her own pulse as she watched her nephew, a child she'd never met, from a sister she'd abandoned, slowly sit up in the dirt and reach out one small hand to touch the nose of a 400-pound African lioness. Kessie's purr carried across the enclosure like distant thunder. Margaret's radio was already in her hand. "This is Dr. Chen. I'm going down." The harness bit into Margaret's shoulders as Rodriguez's team lowered her into the enclosure, every instinct in her veterinary training screaming warnings she chose to ignore. The 18-foot descent felt like falling through 20 years of accumulated silence, each foot bringing her closer to Elena, and to questions she'd spent decades avoiding. Her boots touched the red dirt with a soft thud. The lions didn't move. Kessie's massive head turned toward Margaret with deliberate, calm, amber eyes holding an intelligence that made her skin prickle. The lioness's expression, if such a thing was possible, seemed almost knowing, as if recognizing something in Margaret that she herself had forgotten. "Easy, girl," Margaret whispered, though her voice carried more wonder than fear. She'd worked with big cats for over 2 decades, had delivered cubs and treated injuries and earned their grudging tolerance. But this felt different. Sacred, almost. Elena looked up from where she cradled Marcus against her chest. Up close, Margaret could see the changes 3 years had carved into her older sister's face, the gauntness that spoke of sleepless nights, the gray threading through black hair that had once been lustrous as obsidian. But Elena's eyes held the same fierce protectiveness that had defined their childhood, when she'd stood between Margaret and their father's disappointed silences, between Margaret and the weight of being the smart one, the one destined for American universities and respectable careers. "Maggie." Elena's voice was barely a whisper, but it carried across 30 years like an echo. "You came." The childhood nickname hit Margaret like a physical blow. No one had called her Maggie since Danny's funeral, when Elena had stood at the graveside whispering Filipino prayers their grandmother had taught them. Prayers Margaret had been too rational, too educated, too American to remember. "I'm here," Margaret said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. She knelt slowly, aware of 4 sets of lion eyes tracking her movement. "Let me see him." Marcus was perhaps 7 years old, with Elena's dark hair and skin that spoke of their shared Filipino heritage. His eyes were open now but unfocused, pupils responding normally to the afternoon light. A goose egg was forming at his temple, but his breathing remained steady. "Probable concussion," Margaret murmured, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. "But no obvious fractures. He needs a hospital." "The lions," Elena said softly. "They protected him when he fell, just like Lola said they would." Margaret's hands stilled. "Elena, this is shock talking. You pushed your son into a lion enclosure. These animals could have killed him?" Elena's laugh was bitter. "Look around you, Maggie. Look at where we are." For the first time, Margaret truly absorbed the scene. 4 African lions sat in a protective semicircle, their massive bodies radiating calm. Django, the pride male, had positioned himself between them and the viewing platform above. Amara and young Tao flanked Elena and Marcus like living shields. And Kessie? Kessie had moved closer during Margaret's examination, her great head now inches from Marcus's face. The boy's small hand rested against the lioness's muzzle, and that impossible purr continued rumbling through the enclosure like a heartbeat made audible. "This isn't possible," Margaret breathed. "Neither was Danny talking to that dog," Elena said quietly. "But you were too afraid to listen." The words hit Margaret's chest like a physical blow. Danny had always been different, sensitive to animals in ways that defied explanation. She'd dismissed it as autism spectrum behavior, had scheduled specialists and behavioral therapists instead of paying attention to the wonder in his eyes when he spoke about creatures only he seemed to understand. If she'd listened, if she'd believed, if she'd been home instead of performing emergency surgery on a sea lion, maybe Danny would still be alive. "I came because you asked," Elena continued, her voice growing weaker. "In your dreams. Every night for a month. You called his name." Margaret's breath caught. She had been dreaming of Danny, vivid dreams where he stood at this very enclosure, telling her something important she could never quite remember upon waking. Dreams that left her hollow and aching and desperate for coffee strong enough to wash away the taste of regret. "Lola always said the animals knew," Elena whispered, "that they could see what we'd forgotten how to look for. Healing, connection, the spaces between what's rational and what's true." Above them, Margaret could hear Rodriguez coordinating with emergency medical teams. Soon, this moment would dissolve into protocols and paperwork, into rational explanations that would satisfy insurance companies and zoo boards, but explain nothing about why 4 predators had chosen protection over prey. Marcus stirred in Elena's arms, his dark eyes finding Margaret's face. When he spoke, his voice carried the same quiet certainty she remembered from Danny's last words. "The lions say you're sad about something. They want to help." Kessie's purr deepened, vibrating through the earth beneath them like an ancient song Margaret's rational mind had forgotten but her heart somehow remembered. In the distance, sirens wailed their approach. The sirens grew louder, but their urgent wailing couldn't drown out the impossible purr that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. Margaret knelt frozen between her scientific training and something far more ancient, watching her nephew's small fingers trace the massive lioness's whiskers with the casual intimacy of a child petting a house cat. "Dr. Chen," Rodriguez's voice cracked through her radio. "Paramedics are here. We need you and the civilians out now. Media trucks are pulling up and the board—" Margaret clicked off the radio without responding. Above them, she could hear the chaos of arriving emergency vehicles, the slam of doors, the bark of official voices trying to impose order on the impossible. But down here, in this circle of lions and red dirt and whispered Filipino words, time moved differently. Elena was studying her with those dark eyes that had always seen too much. "You don't remember, do you? What Lola told us that last night in the hospital." Margaret's chest tightened. "Elena, this isn't the time for—" "About the Kapamilya ng Hayop." Elena's voice carried the same reverence their grandmother had used for the old stories. The animal family. How some children are born with the gift to speak across the space between species. How the spirits choose certain souls to bridge the worlds. The words triggered something buried deep in Margaret's memory. A hospital room thick with disinfectant and dying flowers, her 6-year-old self fidgeting in an uncomfortable chair, while their grandmother's papery voice wove stories that made no sense to her rational, American-educated mind. Some children, mga anak, they are born with 1 foot in each world. The spirits whisper to them through fur and feather, through claw and fang. But the gift requires faith, and faith requires sacrifice. Margaret had dismissed it as delirium, folklore, the confused ramblings of an old woman whose mind was already halfway to whatever came after. She'd walked away from that bedside, away from Elena's tear-streaked face, away from their grandmother's outstretched hand, just like she'd walked away from Danny's wonder 3 years ago. "He was trying to tell you," Elena continued, shifting Marcus higher against her chest. The boy's eyes had drifted closed again, but his breathing remained steady. That day at the neighbor's house, Danny wasn't just being impulsive. The dog was sick, Maggie. Heartworms, advanced stage. Danny could sense it. Margaret's world tilted. "That's impossible." The veterinary exam showed exactly what Danny said it would. 2 weeks after the funeral, when Mrs. Patterson finally brought Rex in for his shots. Elena's voice was gentle but implacable. The vet found advanced heartworm disease, said it was lucky they caught it when they did, or the dog would have died within days. The red dirt seemed to shift beneath Margaret's knees. She remembered that day with crystalline clarity. Danny standing at the fence, his hands pressed against the chain link, whispering to Rex in that particular way that had always made her nervous. The dog had been aggressive, territorial, had bitten 2 delivery drivers that month. But under Danny's touch, Rex had gone still, his amber eyes fixed on the boy's face with an intensity that had made Margaret's skin crawl. "He's hurting, Mama. Inside hurting. Can we help him?" She'd said no. Had pulled Danny away from the fence, scheduled an appointment with his behavioral therapist, made notes about managing his animal obsessions. That night, while she'd worked late reviewing surgical protocols, Danny had climbed the fence himself. Rex hadn't bitten him. The coroner's report had been clear on that point. Danny had suffered the fatal fall when the dog, startled by approaching sirens, had jumped up in excitement, knocking the small boy from his precarious perch on the fence post. But now Elena was saying Danny had been right all along, that her son's strange intuition hadn't been autism spectrum fixation but something else entirely, something their grandmother would have recognized and nurtured instead of medicalizing and managing into submission. Kessie shifted closer, her massive form radiating warmth. When she looked at Margaret, those amber eyes held an expression of such profound sympathy that Margaret's breath caught in her throat. For one impossible moment, she could have sworn she heard Danny's voice carried on the afternoon wind. "Don't be afraid any more, Mama. The dreams," Margaret whispered. "What did he say in the dreams?" Elena's smile was sad and knowing, that you needed to remember that there are things medical school can't teach, and some healings require more than science. She gestured toward the lions surrounding them. "Marcus has been sick since birth, autoimmune disorder. The doctors in Manila gave him 6 months, maybe less." Margaret's trained eye reassessed the boy's pallor, the fragility beneath his small frame. "Elena, if you brought him here thinking that some kind of mystical—" "I brought him here because he asked me to." Elena's voice was firm. "Because 3 weeks ago, he started having dreams about lions, about an auntie with sad eyes who needed to remember how to listen. Above them, the chaos was intensifying. Margaret could hear Rodriguez arguing with someone, probably the zoo director, about liability and protocols and the media nightmare unfolding outside the gates. But Marcus was stirring again, his dark eyes opening to fix on Margaret's face with an intensity that made her heart stutter. When he spoke, his voice carried uncertainty that shattered every rational explanation she'd spent 23 years building around her grief. "Kuya, Danny says it's time to come home now." The name hit Margaret like a physical blow, driving the air from her lungs. Kuya, big brother in Tagalog, the language their grandmother had whispered during bedtime stories Margaret had been too proud to remember. No one had told Marcus about Danny. Elena had been estranged from the family since before Marcus was born, and Margaret had never even acknowledged this nephew's existence. "How do you know that name?" Margaret's voice came out as barely a whisper. Marcus blinked up at her with those impossibly knowing eyes. "He's right there." The boy lifted one small hand, pointing to empty air beside Kessie's massive head. "He says you can't see him because you stopped believing in things that don't make sense." Margaret's hands began to shake. She pressed them against her thighs, trying to anchor herself in the solid reality of bone and muscle, in 23 years of veterinary training that had taught her to trust only what could be measured and treated and cured. "Maggie." Elena's voice was growing weaker. "Look at me." Margaret forced her gaze away from Marcus, from the impossible calm in his expression, to focus on her sister. What she saw there made her stomach drop. Elena's pallor wasn't just from shock or fear, the gauntness in her face, the way she held herself as if every breath cost her. These were signs Margaret recognized from years of delivering terminal diagnoses to pet owners. "How long?" Margaret asked. 4 months, maybe 5. Elena's smile was serene, resigned. "Pancreatic, stage 4. There's nothing left to try except—" She gestured around the enclosure. "This." "Elena, no." Margaret crawled closer, her knees scraping against the red dirt. There are treatments, clinical trials. I have connections at Scripps, at UCSD. We can what? Buy me another month of chemo that makes me too sick to hold my son? Elena shook her head. I tried your way, Maggie. I spent 2 years believing in science, in rational medicine, and all it did was steal time I should have been spending with Marcus. Above them, Margaret could hear new voices joining the chaos. Official voices, legal voices. The kind of voices that would turn this impossible moment into a media circus, a case study, a lawsuit that would destroy careers and explanations. Dr. Chen, Rodriguez's voice carried a new edge of panic. Channel 8 is setting up cameras. The zoo director is demanding immediate extraction. If those lions turn, they won't turn. The certainty in Margaret's voice surprised her. She looked around the circle of massive predators, at Django's protective stance and Amara's calm gaze and young Tao's almost playful curiosity. They're not going to hurt anyone. But even as she said it, Margaret's rational mind catalogued the impossibility. Lions didn't behave this way. Apex predators didn't form protective circles around prey animals. There was no evolutionary advantage, no biological imperative, no scientific explanation for why 4 African lions were sitting like guardian statues around a dying woman and her sick child. Marcus stirred again, his small hand finding Kessie's massive paw. The lioness didn't flinch, didn't pull away. Instead, she lowered her great head until her forehead nearly touched the boy's chest. That impossible purr deepened, resonating through the ground like a living thing. "She's trying to tell you something," Marcus whispered, his eyes still fixed on the empty space beside Kessie. "Kuya Danny says you used to know how to listen, before you got scared." Margaret's throat closed. She did remember fragments of childhood when animals had seemed to speak in languages her adult mind had forgotten. The stray cat that had led 6-year-old Margaret to Mrs. Garcia's injured grandson, the neighbor's parrot that had screamed warnings before earthquakes, the old dog at their grandmother's house that had whined and paced for days before Lola's first heart attack. She dismissed them all, filed them under coincidence, pattern recognition, childhood imagination, built a career on the solid foundation of empirical evidence and peer-reviewed research. But Danny had inherited something she'd abandoned. And now Marcus— "The dreams," Elena continued, her voice growing fainter. "Every night for a month, Danny standing at this enclosure saying you needed to remember that healing isn't always about curing. Sometimes it's about coming home." Margaret's radio crackled again. This time it was a voice she didn't recognize. Crisp, authoritative, dangerous. "Dr. Chen, this is Director Phillips. You have 60 seconds to clear that enclosure before we authorize tranquilizer deployment. The liability exposure alone—" Margaret clicked off the radio and dropped it in the dirt. Around her, the lions shifted closer. Not threatening, not aggressive, but forming what could only be described as a protective circle. Kessie's amber eyes met Margaret's, and in their depths she saw something that made her chest ache with recognition. The same expression Danny used to get when he was trying to explain something important that only he could see. Marcus smiled, his small face radiant with impossible peace. "Kuya Danny says you're ready now." "Ready for what?" Margaret wanted to ask. But the words died in her throat as the first tranquilizer dart whistled through the air above their heads.
The dart embedded itself in the dirt 6 inches from Margaret's knee with a wet thunk that made her blood freeze. Cassie's massive head snapped toward the sound, a low growl rumbling from her throat, not directed at them, but at the threat from above. "No," Margaret breathed, scrambling to shield Marcus and Elena with her body. "Rodriguez, call it off. Call IT off." But her radio lay silent in the dirt where she'd dropped it, and above them she could hear Director Phillips barking orders about acceptable losses and negligent employees. The clinical detachment in his voice, the same tone she'd used countless times when discussing euthanasia protocols, made her stomach turn. Marcus wasn't looking at the chaos above. His dark eyes remained fixed on that empty space beside Kessie, and when he spoke, his voice carried a strange urgency. "Kuya Danny says they're going to hurt the lions. He says you have to choose now." "Choose what?" Margaret's voice cracked as Django rose to his feet, his massive frame blocking the sight lines from above. The other lions followed suit, their formation tightening into something that looked disturbingly tactical. "Between what you know and what you remember," Elena whispered. Her breathing had become labored, each word a visible effort. "Between the daughter who walked away from Lola's bedside and the one who used to dance with fireflies." Margaret's chest clenched. She hadn't thought about the fireflies in decades, how 6-year-old Maggie had been convinced they were fairy lights, following their glow through their grandmother's garden, while Lola told stories about spirits that moved between worlds. Elena remembered. Of course Elena remembered. While Margaret had been busy forgetting everything that couldn't be quantified or peer-reviewed, her sister had carried their grandmother's wisdom like a sacred flame. Another dart whistled overhead, this one closer. Tao let out a warning roar that echoed off the enclosure walls like thunder. "Dr. Chen, you have 30 seconds to extract yourself before we deploy flashbangs." Phillips's voice carried through a bullhorn now, amplified for the growing crowd of media and emergency responders. "We will not be held responsible for casualties resulting from your negligence." The word negligence hit Margaret like a physical blow. How many times had she used that same clinical language to distance herself from failure? How many pet owners had she faced across sterile examination tables, explaining that some conditions were beyond treatment, beyond hope, beyond the reach of rational medicine? She'd become everything their grandmother had warned against. A healer who'd forgotten that some wounds couldn't be sutured, some pain couldn't be medicated away. "Maggie." Elena's hand found hers, cool and impossibly fragile. "Do you remember what Lola said about the bridge children?" Margaret closed her eyes, trying to summon memories she'd spent decades burying. Fragments surfaced like debris from a shipwreck, candlelight flickering across her grandmother's weathered face, the scent of sampaguita flowers and burning sage, words spoken in careful English mixed with Tagalog phrases that carried meanings no translation could capture. "Some souls are born to stand between worlds," MGA Anak. "They speak the languages of fur and feather, of root and stone. But the gift comes with a price. They must choose which world to serve." "She said they were rare," Margaret whispered, the memory crystallizing with painful clarity. "The bridge children. And that most of them forgot their gift when they learned to be afraid." Marcus shifted in Elena's arms, reaching out to touch Margaret's cheek with fingers that smelled of lion musk and childhood innocence. "Kuya Danny says you didn't forget. You just got scared after Mama and Papa died. But he's been waiting for you to remember." The ground beneath them seemed to tilt. Their parents had died when Margaret was 8, Elena barely 5, a car accident that had shattered their small family and sent both girls to live with their grandmother. Margaret had responded by throwing herself into schoolwork, into the safe predictability of grades and achievements. Elena had clung to their grandmother's stories, to the possibility that love could transcend the boundaries of death. "The night terrors," Margaret breathed, understanding dawning like a cold sunrise. "After the funeral. You said you could see them." Elena nodded weakly. "In Lola's garden, by the sampaguita bushes. They looked happy." Margaret had called it trauma response, had insisted Elena see a counselor, had armed herself with psychology textbooks and rational explanations for why grief could manifest as supernatural experiences. She'd been protecting Elena from delusion, from the dangerous comfort of believing in impossible things. Or she'd been protecting herself from a truth too large for her 8-year-old mind to process. A flashbang clattered into the enclosure, its metallic surface gleaming in the afternoon sun. 5 seconds until detonation, maybe less. Kessie moved with liquid grace, her massive paw batting the device toward the far wall like a toy. It exploded harmlessly against concrete, the sound muffled by distance but still sharp enough to make Margaret's ears ring. Above them, Philip's voice rose to a shout. "Deploy the nets! Now!" The net dropped from above like a falling sky, its weighted edges designed to entangle and subdue. Margaret watched in horror as the heavy mesh descended toward Marcus and Elena. But Django was already moving. The massive male lion lunged upward with impossible grace, his powerful jaws closing around a section of net. The entire apparatus jerked sideways, crashing harmlessly against the enclosure wall in a tangle of rope and metal weights. "Jesus Christ," Phillips's voice crackled through the abandoned radio, no longer professional but raw with shock. "How did it? That's not possible. Lions don't coordinate like that." But Margaret was no longer listening to Phillips. She was staring at Marcus, whose small face had gone suddenly pale, his eyes rolling back until only the whites showed. Elena's grip tightened on her son as his body began to convulse. Not the violent seizure Margaret had witnessed in sick animals, but something else. Something that made the air itself seem to shimmer. When Marcus spoke again, his voice wasn't his own. It carried the cadence of a 23-year-old veterinarian who'd been dead for 2 decades. Words spoken with Danny's particular mix of wonder and certainty. "Mama, you have to see, really see, not with your scared grown-up eyes." Margaret's world tilted off its axis. The voice, the inflection, even the way Marcus tilted his head. It was Danny, impossibly, undeniably Danny, speaking through this dying boy she'd never met until today. "This isn't real," Margaret whispered. But even as she said it, she felt the words crumble like ash in her mouth. Because Kessie was moving again, the lioness positioning herself directly in front of Marcus with deliberate precision. And when the great cat's amber eyes met Margaret's, she saw in them a recognition that made her chest ache with impossible hope. Danny's eyes, the same mixture of love and disappointment that had haunted her dreams for 23 years. "You promised," Marcus continued in Danny's voice, and now Margaret could see tears streaming down the boy's cheeks. "The night before the fence, you said if anything ever happened, you'd listen to what the animals were trying to tell you. You said you'd remember how to be my mama who danced with fireflies." The memory hit Margaret like a physical blow. Danny had woken from a nightmare that last night, sobbing about Rex and hurting and something terrible coming. She'd held him in the darkness of his bedroom, surrounded by his collection of animal drawings, and made a promise she'd forgotten until this moment. "If you're ever scared, baby, if anything ever happens and I'm not there to protect you, just remember, the animals will know. They'll help you find your way home to me." Empty words, she'd thought then. Comfort for a frightened child. But Danny had believed them with the absolute faith that only children possessed, and he died trying to help an animal, just as their grandmother had always said bridge children would. "The night Rex died," Margaret said slowly, understanding crystallizing like ice in her veins. "You weren't trying to climb over to pet him. You were trying to heal him." Marcus nodded with Danny's remembered gravity. "The hurt was too big for a little boy to fix, but I had to try, Mama. You taught me that healers don't walk away from pain just because it's scary." Above them, Margaret could hear Philip shouting orders about backup protocols and emergency authorization. But his voice seemed to come from another world now, muffled and meaningless compared to the impossible conversation unfolding in the red dirt of the lion enclosure. Elena's breathing had grown more labored, but her eyes were bright with something that might have been hope. "Tell her about the files, Danny, about what her husband hid." Margaret's blood turned to ice water. "What files?" Marcus, Danny, tilted his head with that particular expression of reluctant truth-telling that had always preceded difficult conversations. "The ones Uncle Robert found after Papa Richard died, about the boy in the security footage. Papa Richard knew it wasn't me in that video, Mama. He knew it was Marcus's big brother, Miguel." The words hit Margaret like a defibrillation shock, stopping her heart before jump-starting it into chaotic rhythm. "That's impossible. Elena, tell him that's—" But Elena's face had gone gray as concrete. "Miguel," she whispered. "My first son. He died when Marcus was born. Complications during delivery. The doctor said—" Her voice broke. "They said there was nothing they could have done." Margaret's training kicked in automatically. 36 years of medical education demanding rational explanations. "Elena, you're confused. The trauma, the illness—" "I'm not confused." Elena's voice carried absolute certainty. "And neither was your husband when he paid the hospital to falsify the death certificate. When he arranged for Miguel's body to be cremated before I could see him. When he told everyone that your Danny had died saving another child, instead of the truth. The truth." Margaret felt it settling around her shoulders like a lead blanket, heavy with the weight of decades of carefully constructed lies. Phillips's voice crackled through the radio one more time. "Some children are expendable, Dr. Chen. That's just reality." But as Kessie's protective growl rumbled through the earth beneath them, Margaret finally understood who the real predator had always been.